guess the problem of having an unfamiliar name is like people will find ways to call your name. So today I wanted to talk about continuous. Well, I guess today we wanted to talk about the continuous delivery, which is the whole theme of the day. But of course, for the technical people like myself, the reason this topic is kind of fascinating is because it makes me talk about, it allows me to talk about the automation, which is really what I'm more sort of passionate about. Because there's a lot of effort going on in this industry, and there's a number of buzzwords that's sort of all driving the envelope of automation in such a way that sort of we are really starting to see sort of end-to-end, that automation that's going on. And then I think, my particular vehicle to sort of into this sort of game display is by Jenkins. So if you look at the Jenkins adoption, it seems to me that it's been becoming very, very strong in recent years. So for example, if you look at the year over year, the adoption increase of the Jenkins serve, for example, we started tracking this number around 2008. So as people install Jenkins instances, they can send back their usage information into our community server. And then so we can track those numbers. And so it's been showing a nice growth. And so I was quite happy, but something suddenly happened. And like now we are looking at the close to 4 million jobs that's deployed on your Jenkins instances. So talk about the job creators. I think we got the great candidate for presidency right here. And perhaps in reflection to this adoption, I think nowadays you cannot really go to any technology conferences without hearing the name Jenkins dropped a couple of times. If you've been to the Amazon's reInvent conference, this is the biggest show that the AWS would throw at, you hear from the guy from Amazon actually talking about the Jenkins in the context of the products that they have. Or if you go to the Google Cloud Platform live event, that was the broadcasted online, you'll see Jenkins appear in their demo, which is quite unusual for Google to do. And so I guess the 1,400 people have watched the Jenkins appear in the demo screen, and I was really fascinated. And then all people are talking about these audio issues, so I was also a bit sad to see that. And here it is, the Jenkins would appear in the slide as well. So in a number of these big players in the industry, the Jenkins would play a pretty significant role. This happened, I think, the last week. The Docker is all the rage among the technical folks nowadays. And then if they're in their keynote, there it is, the Mr. Jenkins making an appearance in much the same way that the GitHub is. So it's again, it's showing quite a bit of the adoptions. Another company called Rebel Labs did a survey mainly among Java developers, asking how many, what kind of tools people are using, and it turns out that the 70% of the people who are doing continuous integration was using Jenkins. So this is by far the most adopted continuous integration server. It's so much so that we even appeared in TV show. I don't know how popular this show is around here. We live in California. We sort of watch this show with excitement. But in one of the shows, so there was a protagonist was trying to develop this application. This was like the 4 a.m. in the morning. So it's like in the last crunch, and then there it is. The Jenkins would come to save the day. So he's running the test to make sure that everything is fine. And when this built and test passes, it turns green, and the people are happy, and then that's the climax of the episode. So I felt like I didn't pay a single buck to have this product placement. So it's a truly amazing moment. But it just speaks to the popularity of Jenkins, I think. And then if you think about why Jenkins is becoming so popular, I think the part of the motivation is that there's all sorts of this diversity in our environment. The kind of tools that we use are very, very different. Some tools, we use it because we've been using it for 10 years. Other tools, we use it because it makes more sense to use it. In larger organizations, this gets more complex, and so on. So the Jenkins would sort of come in without any sort of prescriptive approach into what you should be using. But instead, it provides a good integration with just about everything. So I wanted to touch some of these point integration, and then I guess Steve already talked about that, but for example, one of the important, significant point integration that we are nowadays doing is with the Puppet and Chef. So, these tools are very, very popular among operations people. So operations people have achieved significant degree of automations, partly due to these tools. And now the developers are also achieving significant degree of automation in the build and test space. So now, if you think about the delivery from the beginning to the end, well, most of it is now automated, okay, but they are using like a slightly different set of tools with different people. Now, how can you combine these things and make them work together very well? So we started thinking about this kind of problem, and then so we came up with what we called as a fingerprint-based traceability. So this is all available in the open source Jenkins, and that allows you to track exactly when bits are deployed to which servers, and that in turn allows you to build up broader automations. So for example, you could say, okay, now the bits are deployed to the more than 85% of the production servers, so you're gonna run the preliminary smoke test to make sure there's no critical performance regression in the production servers, and then so on and so forth. Another very important point integration would be with Docker. So this is an emerging technology to containerize the applications. And I have to say, as a former Sun guy, that we had these zones and everything like 10 years ago, and nobody was caring. And now the Linux has it, and suddenly like it's the best thing in the world. So I have some problem with that, but I gotta talk about Docker. So the Docker, for example, there's a number of effort in the community to create a great Docker integration with Jenkins. One of those would be to use this isolated Docker environment as a place to run the clean build. So it would drastically improve the reproducibility of the environment. So eliminate some of the grunt work that otherwise the administrator would have to do to keep the environment clean, make it look exactly the same across the large number of masters. So all these problems would kind of disappear. And then once the build is done, the container could be thrown away and then be restarted from scratch, and then so makes it easier, even more easier to manage these things. Or if you look at some of the things that we CloudBees do in Jenkins Enterprise by CloudBees, we have a number of features that integrates Jenkins with Git, which is another very important point integration with Jenkins, right? As more and more people use Git. Git would enable certain kind of workflows that's otherwise impossible, and such as allowing developers to basically send work-in-progress changes over to Jenkins and have it run the tests for you while the developer is working on some other features. So I sometimes think of this as the doctor/nurse relationship. If you go to see a hospital, the time you actually get to spend with doctor is pretty small. So the hospital maximizes around the notion of keeping doctors busy and productive. So they provide additional help like nurses so that other things like running tests could be done by this. So in this kind of environment, the developer will be kept busy on just typing up the code, and the test will be delegated back into Jenkins. And people have to worry too much about when it breaks the test, because Jenkins is acting as a gatekeeper, and only when the changes successfully pass the test, it hits the team repository. So this is so there's lots of point integration like that we provide both in open source and in our offerings that makes Jenkins very useful in just about any environment. And then another reason I think the Jenkins is popular is when Jenkins does these things, it's completely, so these individual point integrations are not subscriptive. It's not like a all-in-one integrated solution that forces you to change the way you work, but you can actually pick the specific integration that you like and then figure out the way it makes sense for your environment and sort of slowly make gradual improvements to the process. And I think in many larger organizations, this kind of approach works a lot better than like having one vendor come with everything that solves all the world's problems, except that you have to totally change the way you work today into this something that's been unproven. So I think this, this less subscriptive approach, prescriptive approach is a win. Now, so as we sort of started improving these point integrations in Jenkins, we started in the community. We started feeling that okay, we sort of really want to use these technologies by ourselves, sort of to be able to eat the dog food by ourselves, And then that would allow us to learn a lot about, okay, what's the kind of integration we need to provide to do things better. So one of the recent efforts that happened in the community is to actually try to create a top-notch the continuous delivery pipeline that we use ourselves to manage our own Jenkins infrastructure. So I get the impression that one of the lacking part of the Jenkins community today is that there are not too many best practices that you could look at, because most of these development happens inside corporate firewall, and they really can't share what they did. They can talk about, they can put up the diagram and tell you how they did it, but when it gets down to the gory details of okay, so how did they put everything together? Those things are unfortunately not accessible. So Jenkins being an open source project, what we do could be made publicly accessible. So there's a number of reasons we have a motivation to do it. So anyway, so the way we started doing this has been going on for a couple of months now, is that in our Jenkins infrastructure, we have a lot of services that needs to be kept running. So these individual services actually exist in their own little small repositories, and then they are preliminarily defined as a Docker container image. And whenever these changes are happening, so each container has its own corresponding source repository that defines the image, and they are all on GitHub. And whenever the change gets published, it gets automatically pushed into Jenkins, and the Jenkins would build a new container image and then upload this container image into the image repository. And then aside from that, we manage our infrastructure through Puppet. So there's a separate repository that hosts all the Puppet manifest definitions. So these things refer to various containers and say, so this container needs to be deployed here, that container needs to go there, and these are some parameters that needs to be specified and so on. So that exists in the master place. And then whenever the changes get submitted as a pull request on this GitHub repository, and then again, the Jenkins will be used to test, make sure that these pull requests do not contain any preliminary, any obvious programs. So we run the Puppet catalog compilation and some unit tests to make sure that these things will work okay before we waste any time on before we waste any human's time to actually look at the changes. If it doesn't even pass this kind of test, then it's not even worth looking at. And this kind of thing would really save our time. But at some point, when the preliminary test is passed, you still want to make sure that this stuff actually runs when you run it. So we use a tool called Vagrant to temporarily create a bunch of servers on EC2, and then actually run this Puppet manifest and deploy these images to create basically the temporary copy of the Jenkins infrastructure, the parts of it that you care about anyway. And then so that allows us to run the other set of tests that's based on, that's supposed to run against the actual running instances. So this would create a second level of testing. It takes a lot more time and actually costs money to do it, but so that's also the next layer of automation tests that we do. And then finally, if the things passes this point of validation, we'd use the tool. So we'd send these changes to the Puppet enterprise, the Puppet's master, and then in conjunction with a tool called R10K, every branch in GitHub, this Git repository becomes a new environment that's something that you could deploy to the servers if you're so willing. So that allows us to experiment with major changes with that before deploying those into the production set of servers. And then in particular, we have two designated branches called, the one is staging, the other in production. And then these two sets of servers basically run pre-copied on the environments, and all the inbound changes get initially merged into the staging branch, where there's a corresponding set of servers that you could verify how it's going. And then at some point, we would basically, some of the manual inspection, at some point we decide that, okay, this is good enough that we could then deploy this into production. Then we do deployment by basically just doing one Git merge. And then so that becomes our deployment. So I think this kind of, when we actually, so the one last, the problem here is that the catch here is that this is ideally what we'd like to do, except in so Jenkins project being open source, we don't need to actually have enough money to run all the servers all the time. So the staging environment actually doesn't exist 24/7, which is something we want to fix by sort of finding some more resources to run these servers. But anyway, so what I wanted to say was that this kind of sort of combining the Puppet and Vagrant and sort of the pull request in GitHub and then the branching as a merging strategy seems to be a common emerging pattern that many people are trying to deploy. And then you could actually see all the gory details. Every single line of Puppet manifest is available publicly online. So if you're interested in doing something like this, you can go to our community and then look at this in Hearts content. There will be a number of the other guys involved in this effort. I've heard that we'll be doing some presentation on this topic in other Puppet conferences and so on. So, so there's that. Now, so okay. Now, so when we talk about, as we do this effort partly, and also as we talk about all these point-to-point integrations, the community sort of started feeling like too much of this process of creating a continuous delivery pipeline. It's like the sort of jigsaw puzzle. There's the great thing about Jenkins is it's got this huge number of plugins that's just about everything. But each plugin is a little bit unique. And so depending on the environment, you kind of have to combine the right pieces that make sense for your environment. And on one hand, I think it's a great strength because there are so many different ways to combine these pieces. And you can make it fit just about any environment. And you can also create a piece if you want to create one. But at the same time, sort of the act of assembling puzzle could be tedious. And instead, what we really wanted to do is we wanted to become a bit more like the Play-Doh or the clay figures. So if you're trying to build something, instead of finding a piece and it fits them into the right way, if you could only mold the same thing into like whatever shape that you want, it sort of create more flexibility without sacrificing the freedom. So we felt like, you know, we started feeling that there are better ways, there might be better ways to sort of help people orchestrate this kind of large automation that connects these individual point integrations together in a lot more convenient ways. So we started working on this in the past half a year or so by talking to many large users. And in the end, we are calling this effort workflow. And then as Steve was mentioning, finally we were able to make the initial release of this available a few days ago. So one of the key, there's a number of interesting sort of key aspects or key innovations in the workflow. The one is that it is sort of built on top of existing effort. So those of you who have been using Jenkins might have heard of this plugin called Build Flow plugin. And what it does, so this was a hugely successful plugin, judging at the adoption of it. And the basic idea of this plugin is that it uses text. What I wrote here doesn't really matter, but it uses a text to describe the orchestration of the things. And then so that allows the developers to version control these definitions, track changes, and then sort of use their familiar tools to build more orchestration. And then so that was very useful. The other aspect of it is that this text is actually built on top of existing programming language called Groovy. And again, this also allows the developers to sort of instantly feel familiar with the environment. So whenever they wanted to do a loop or create a variables or define some abstraction, which is really necessary when we are talking about a significant enterprise-level complex deployment pipeline, then the ability to create these abstractions in a familiar way turns out to be a great thing. So one of the key aspects of the workflow is to do just that. So yes, we provide the richer control flow. Again, all these things come from the basic language functionality that you get for free. And also, but where we go beyond this original effort with the Build Flow plugin is that we actually, this one workflow is intended to be the place that you can define everything from checking out the source code to doing the build to like moving the file between different servers to coding into other applications like the mid-vision to deploy applications, or so just about anything that Jenkins can do. All sorts of these point integration I talked about today, you could sort of integrate that into the workflow and then coordinate that by using the same scheme. And I think that creates a tremendous simplification in the way people design pipelines. And then since this is like an entirely new subsystem of Jenkins, we are using it to fix a number of long-standing issues that's otherwise very difficult to address. So, often in enterprises, we are talking about test execution that could take hours or days even. And then so one of the unfortunate problem of Jenkins is that so you're into, say, the 2 days into 3 day long testing cycle, and then then you had to restart Jenkins. And then what happened is that the Jenkins would totally forget, so you had to restart Jenkins. And then the Jenkins would totally forget that the build was going on, and then so the whole build would fail, and then you have to do it from scratch again. So this is clearly inefficient. So with the workflow, we are kind of fixing this problem. So now you could happily restart Jenkins anytime while the build is running your processes, and then when it comes back up, it knows where you left off, and then it'd be able to keep on doing what it was supposed to do. So that's very useful. The other aspect of the continuous delivery pipeline is that the part of the idea in the CD is that you want, as a developers, they want to prepare the binary that's always deployable, but ultimately, like when the bits should be deployed is up to the other stakeholder to decide. So that often means in key part of this continuous delivery pipeline, you want some human check and balance processes. Okay, so this version of app, say, changes a database schema. That's something you probably don't want to automatically deploy. So now you could construct this workflow, the orchestration, and tell Jenkins that if the changes contain database schema, then wait for someone to actually approve. And then if that approval comes in, then do something else. So this kind of thing that includes the human interactions, now you could design inside a single workflow without unnecessarily splitting them out into different pieces. Or yet another functionality that we are providing is this ability to create checkpoint. So again, so imagine the complex release automation, let's say. We are talking about the number of steps that has to be done by a different stakeholder. And then so let's say each one of these steps would take a few hours to complete. And then the unfortunate consequence of having a complex release process that there's a chance that some of these processes fail, sometimes randomly, or sometimes for some silly reasons, like, okay, the disk was full. And when that failure happens, what you do not want to do is to go all the way back to the beginning and redo everything from scratch, because then that would be a tremendous waste of time. Right? So in talking to people who are doing this kind of workflow, the choreography in the orchestration in Jenkins, what we discovered is that the ability to go back to this, the somewhere middle point, avoiding going back to the beginning, forces them to create significant complexity. So in this workflow feature, we allow you to create checkpoints, which is basically like a way of you telling Jenkins that this is a significant milestone that I want you to remember. And then when the failure happens, instead of going all the way back, you can just go back to the checkpoint that you want to restart things from. And then you could simply re-execute things after the checkpoint until things should complete. So, again, the part of the pain of the release process automation is that it just doesn't run often enough for you to be able to weed out all these one-off problems. So now you don't have to try to work very hard to eliminate these problems. You can just let it fail and then simply restart from the known checkpoint. So that's sort of the quick tour around so what we are doing in the Jenkins. One is that there's never-ending list of individual point integrations that's produced by the community and families alike. And also the fact that these individual point integrations are available and then allow you to combine them in arbitrary ways, I think is actually a great boon for the deployment of Jenkins in the complex environment like enterprises. And also sort of, as I was able to show you in the way we deploy our infrastructure through the continuous delivery, there are a few these very successful CD deployment pipelines available in the community. And if you go look at some of the Jenkins user conference talks, some of the users specifically come to talk about these things. And finally, now we are sort of really unrolling this significant new feature that I'm really excited about called workflow as a sort of glue to connect all of these things together. And so that's sort of what I wanted you to sort of take away today. So with that, I think that's basically the end of my talk and the end of my time. I think I have probably 5 more minutes to ask for questions. Right, so okay, so the question was, is the checkpoint part of the open source? So right now, actually, yes, I guess I didn't mention that. But this is the one feature that we are keeping in the Jenkins Enterprise by Cloud piece right now. So that's the current one. Yeah. Right. So the question about so what about the visualization of the workflow? At the foundation level, what we are focusing on is when the workflow executes, I want that to leave enough records that allows people to create visualizations. So right now that's the main focus of. And now we are trying to bring in the other sets of people who are actually good at producing UIs to now use this data to produce different kinds of visualizations. And one thing we find is that the different kind of job profiles need a different dashboard. As a developer, you'd care about how far your change has gone. As an operations guy, they care about which version of things are running on which environment. As a manager, you care about where the things are sort of stuck. And so these things, I think we call for different visualization. And so I think we are building a foundation to enable all of that. Yeah. Right. Okay. So the question was, I think it's pull requests are becoming very popular way of collaborating. So what's the Jenkins story on that? So there's actually a couple of stories here. In the one that I showed, the Git validated more, is there's an extra plugin that sits on top of it that allows you to work with the GitHub so that Jenkins would automatically test the pull request and then submit the result back into the pull request as a comment. So you can hear that. Then there's another plugin, another sort of subsystem that's the Groupon has done called .ci, and they offer some functionality like that on their own. So there's a number of independent efforts in the community to basically do that. Yeah. So the question is like, what's my experience of using Docker for actually deploying apps? Oh boy. So let's see, how much am I, so this is kind of recorded, so. So I think it's sort of like a great, it definitely has some values that it brings in. Like it allows you to think about one service in isolation of others. And that means like for the purpose of testing, I could just launch that container and run the test without worrying about bringing up the whole environment. And that definitely simplifies a lot of things. And at the same time, I get the impression that the Docker guys are busy working on sort of more sort of like a sexy features and a lot of things that we expect that's like a very obvious features, like being able to look at the logs of the running containers, or being able to go into the running containers to do some diagnostic stuff. That's just clearly missing. So I felt a little bit disappointed by the immaturity of the platform. And then there's, as I mentioned, there's a part of cynical former Sun guy says, look, you already had this thing. You guys didn't care before. Like, what's going on here? What's new? So there's that as well. So I think beyond that, I need more beer. Okay, I think thank you very much.